Welcome to Auntie Rose Narrates, where the life stories unfold, full of emotions, memories, and lessons we all can feel. What happens when the person you've loved your whole life walks away, leaving you alone? Let me tell you the story. When my daughter-in-law asked me to sit quietly in the corner, I smiled instead of crying. I still remember that moment very clearly. The room was full of people, but I felt like I was invisible. Plates were clinking, soft laughter floated around the table, and yet my heart felt very, very alone. I had chosen to look simple that day. An old dress, no jewelry, my hair tied back the way I wore it when my children were small. They looked at me and saw a woman who knew nothing, a poor mother, a quiet one, a woman with no voice. And maybe that is why the truth showed itself so easily, because when people believe you have nothing, they stop hiding who they really are. I did not interrupt. I did not explain. I did not correct them. I just listened. That was the day I learned something painful. Not about money, not about pride, but about hearts. Some people are kind only when they think you matter. Others remain kind even when they think you do not. And once you see that difference, you can never unsee it. My name is Margaret. And before anyone ever called me a mother-in-law, before I learned how painful that title could become, I was simply a mother who tried every day to do right by her child. A quiet woman who believed that love showed itself best in small, steady actions rather than loud promises. And my journey into this chapter of life began many years earlier when I lost my husband unexpectedly and found myself standing alone in a small house with a little boy who still waited for footsteps that would never return. And in those early years, grief settled into my bones like winter cold, teaching me how to wake up even when I wanted to stay wrapped in memory. How to prepare breakfast with steady hands, even when my heart felt unsteady, and how to become both mother and father without letting bitterness take root. Because Daniel needed stability more than I needed sympathy, and so I worked quietly, saved carefully, and learned to stretch simple meals into memories of warmth. And through all of it, I discovered that silence can be a form of strength when it is chosen with care. And as Daniel grew older, he learned patience from watching me wait, kindness from watching me forgive, and humility from watching me live without asking for recognition. And I believed deeply that the values I lived by would protect him, even when I could not. And for many years, that belief felt rewarded as Daniel became gentle, respectful, and thoughtful, the kind of young man who still called to check if I had eaten, who carried groceries without being asked, and who hugged me a little longer than necessary before leaving. And when he told me when he had met someone, and that his voice carried both excitement and nervousness, my first feeling was hope, not fear, because I wanted his life to be fuller than mine had been. And when he introduced me to Emily, I welcomed her sincerely, noticing how carefully she spoke, how polite her manners were, and how her smile seemed practiced yet pleasant. And I told myself that love often looks different in different homes, and that patience would help us meet in the middle. And over time, I learned small details about her family through the stories she shared, about dinners where conversations focused on progress and plans, about expectations spoken plainly, and about success measured outwardly rather than quietly. And I listened without judgment, knowing that every family develops its own language of love. And when I finally met her parents, their presence filled the room, their voices confident, their questions precise. And though they were kind in form, there was a subtle evaluation behind their curiosity, as if they were assembling a picture of me piece by piece to decide where I belonged. And when they asked about my life, I answered honestly but simply, never exaggerating, never minimizing, just speaking from a place of peace. And I noticed then how quickly conclusions formed when details were left unadorned. And rather than correct those assumptions, I allowed them to exist. Not out of dishonesty, but because I had learned that people often reveal more about themselves when they believe you have little to offer. And as wedding plans began, meetings were scheduled, opinions shared, and roles assigned without much discussion. And I found myself stepping naturally into the background, watching as decisions were made with enthusiasm and certainty. And whenever I offered a suggestion, it was accepted politely and then gently set aside. And I told myself that weddings are emotional times, that stress sharpens voices and narrows vision, and that love would settle things once the excitement faded. And during those months, I chose to dress plainly, speak softly, and participate without taking control. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed harmony mattered more than authority. And I noticed how often Emily's mother spoke about appearances, about how things would look to guests, about standards that needed to be met. And I listened without comment, even when I felt the quiet implication that my simpler ways did not quite align. And though I could have spoken up, shared my experience, or corrected the image forming around me, I held back, believing that time would allow understanding to grow naturally. And in moments alone, I reminded myself that this was Daniel's beginning, not my stage, and that my role was to support, not command. And still, there were small moments that lingered with me, like the way conversations shifted when I entered a room, or how discussions about finances happened openly without a single glance in my direction, as though my presence did not warrant acknowledgement. And even then, I brushed it aside, choosing grace over pride, because I trusted that kindness would be returned in time. And as the wedding day approached, I felt both joy and quiet distance, happiness for my son intertwined with an unspoken awareness that my place in his life was changing faster than I had prepared for. And on the evening before the wedding, I sat alone in my kitchen, the house unusually silent, and reflected on how easily a woman's worth can be mistaken for simplicity when she chooses peace over performance. And I realized then that while I had spent my life teaching my son values rooted in respect and compassion, I had entered a family that measured worth through presentation and position. And still I carried hope into that ceremony, believing that shared love would soften those differences, and that once life settled into routine, warmth would replace formality, and bonds would grow from familiarity. Because I wanted to believe that family, once joined, naturally learns to care beyond surface impressions. And with that belief, I stepped forward quietly, holding my past with dignity, my present with patience, and my future with cautious optimism, unaware that this calm beginning was preparing me for lessons that would test not my strength, but my understanding of human hearts. After the wedding was over and the last guests had returned to their lives, I told myself that everything would find its natural place with time, that the awkward pauses and unfamiliar routines were simply part of learning how to be a family again in a new shape. And for a while, I truly believed that if I stayed gentle and patient, warmth would return on its own, because love, I thought, had a way of smoothing rough edges if you did not rush it. And so I continued reaching out in small, careful ways, calling to ask how their week had gone, offering to drop off meals when Daniel sounded tired, and reminding myself that being present did not always mean being needed. Yet even in those early months, I could feel a subtle shift that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. A sense that my presence was slowly becoming optional rather than welcomed. And at first it showed itself in innocent ways, like invitations that arrived later than planned, or visits that were shorter and more formal than before. And each time I excused it in my mind by saying that married life brings new responsibilities and schedules. But then there were moments that lingered longer, moments that replayed quietly in my thoughts late at night when the house was still, such as the way Emily would answer my questions politely but without curiosity, as if she were completing a task rather than having a conversation, or how discussions at dinner would continue around me rather than with me, flowing easily between others while my thoughts remained unspoken, and I would sit there listening, nodding, smiling at the right moments, reminding myself that silence can be misunderstood, but is often safer than speaking in places where your words may not land. And gradually, I noticed how roles were forming without my consent, how I was beginning to be treated less like a mother and more like an observer, someone whose presence was acknowledged but whose input was unnecessary. And when Emily's parents visited more often, those feelings deepened, because their conversations carried an ease that did not include me. And when topics turned to careers, financial plans, or future investments, I was spoken around rather than spoken to, and when I stayed quiet, they seemed to take it as confirmation that I had little to contribute. And I became aware of how silence, once a choice, had begun to shape how others perceived my worth. And there were moments when Emily's mother would make comments that sounded harmless but left a quiet ache, like saying how some people are content with simple lives, or how not everyone needs to worry about long-term plans. And each time her eyes would briefly find mine before moving on, and I would smile politely, telling myself that peace mattered more than correcting assumptions. Yet the deeper hurt came not from their words, but from Daniel's quiet absence in those moments, from how he listened without intervening, how he laughed gently and continued conversations as though nothing had been said. And I wondered if he truly did not notice, or if noticing felt too uncomfortable to address. And that unspoken question sat heavily with me, because a son who once noticed everything had grown used to not noticing me, and as weeks turned into months, small behaviors began to repeat often enough that I could no longer dismiss them as coincidence, such as being guided toward seats at the far edge of tables during gatherings, or being thanked quickly for my help before being redirected away from the center of activity. And though no one ever spoke unkindly, kindness without inclusion slowly began to feel like another form of distance. And I recall one afternoon when I arrived early to help Emily prepare for guests, thinking it might bring us closer, only to be met with a gentle smile and a polite request to rest in the living room instead. And I sat there alone listening to laughter, conversations, and clinking dishes from the kitchen, aware that my desire to participate had quietly been replaced by a role of waiting. And I reminded myself again that things change, that perhaps I was struggling to let go. But deep down I knew that help is not refused when it is truly welcomed, and still I did not confront anyone, because confrontation felt too heavy for moments that others would easily dismiss, and I did not want to be seen as sensitive or demanding. And there were other times when comments landed with more clarity, such as Emily's brother once saying jokingly that it must be relaxing not to worry about finances or planning. And though his tone suggested humor, there was an assumption beneath it that I had learned to recognize. And when I laughed softly and let the moment pass, I noticed how easily others accepted that laughter as agreement. And from then on, it seemed expected that I would remain quiet, agreeable, and unchallenging. And perhaps the most painful realization came during an evening gathering when Emily subtly moved my chair to create better balance in the room, guiding me further from the main table without ever asking how I felt. And as I followed her lead, something inside me settled heavily, because it was no longer about space or seating, but about visibility, about where I belonged in this new structure. And later that night, as I drove home through empty streets, I felt a deep sadness not rooted in anger, but in understanding, because I realized that my choice to appear humble had slowly been interpreted as being insignificant, and that once such a belief settles in people's minds, it becomes comfortable for them. And that comfort is rarely challenged unless something forces it, and even then I did not speak, because I wanted to see the full picture clearly before reacting. And so I continued observing, listening, and absorbing, noticing how invitations became more formal, how conversations grew more selective, and how my presence felt less necessary with each passing month. And still I remained calm, reminding myself that reacting too soon can cloud truth, and that understanding often requires patience. And yet late at night I found myself replaying moments, questioning whether I should have spoken earlier, whether silence had protected me or slowly erased me. And while I knew I had done nothing wrong, I also knew that respect unspoken is often respect unseen. And by the time I fully accepted that this pattern was no longer temporary but deeply rooted, that realization sat quietly but firmly within me, preparing my heart for the moment when silence would no longer serve as protection but would instead become the very thing that allowed the truth to reveal itself completely. Moment that changed everything did not come with shouting or dramatic words, and it did not arrive the way people imagine breaking points do, because when it finally came, it was soft, almost ordinary, and that is what made it so painful, because it happened on a quiet afternoon during a family gathering that was meant to feel warm and together, when Emily's parents had invited several relatives and close friends to discuss future plans. And I arrived as usual with a small dish I had prepared carefully, entering the house slowly, greeting everyone with the same gentle politeness I had learned to carry like armor. And as I stepped inside, I sensed immediately that I was not part of what was unfolding, but merely present to witness it. And I told myself that was fine, that I had grown used to being on the edges. And so I took a seat where I was guided without question, listening as the room filled with confident voices speaking openly about money, investments, and long-term arrangements. Conversations that were no longer whispered around me but spoken freely, as though my presence no longer mattered enough to require caution. And at first I listened quietly, but slowly I began to understand that this openness was not inclusion but assumption. The assumption that I could not possibly be relevant to what they were discussing. And that realization settled over me calmly, not like a shock, but like a truth finally rising to the surface. And as the conversation continued, Emily's father spoke with authority about controlling narratives, about how appearances shape respect, and how some people are naturally positioned to lead while others should be grateful to be included at all. And those words were not directed at me directly, but they carried weight in my direction. And when Emily's mother added that some people are comfortable with less, and therefore should not concern themselves with bigger decisions, her voice carried certainty rather than cruelty, and the room responded with nods and agreement. And what struck me most was not the words themselves, but the ease with which they were spoken, as if it was finally safe to say these things openly because the person they were about no longer needed consideration. And as I sat there listening, something inside me grew very still, because I realized in that moment that silence had done its work completely, and they no longer saw me as a person who might feel hurt, but as a background detail who could be spoken over without consequence. And Emily herself sat calmly beside Daniel, nodding along, adding small comments that aligned with her parents, and I watched my son carefully then, searching his face for signs of discomfort or doubt, but what I saw instead was ease. The ease of someone who had adapted so well to a new environment that he no longer noticed who had been left behind. And in that quiet observation, my heart shifted, not breaking, but settling into a deep understanding, because I realized that this was not a misunderstanding anymore, but a belief system that no one felt the need to hide. And it was in that stillness that I finally spoke, not loudly and not with bitterness, but calmly and clearly, because my voice had waited long enough. And I said something simple, something honest, something that did not accuse but revealed. And I said that it was interesting how freely people speak when they believe they are among equals, and how silence is often mistaken for agreement rather than patience. And the room grew quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, because they had not expected my voice to enter that space. And Emily's mother looked at me with surprise rather than anger, as if she were trying to reconcile the calm woman she thought she knew with the clarity she had not anticipated. And no one responded immediately, and that silence felt heavier than all the conversations before it, because it revealed discomfort where confidence once stood. And soon after, I excused myself politely and left, not because I was hurt in that moment, but because I understood something important had already been said. And later that evening, Daniel called me and asked gently if everything was all right. And I told him yes, that I was simply tired, because I did not want to unpack years of quiet hurt over a single phone call. And days later, events unfolded in ways I did not plan, but perhaps subconsciously expected, because a practical matter arose involving property paperwork that required transparency. And suddenly, questions were directed at me rather than around me. And information I had never shared openly was brought to light not through intention but through necessity. And I noticed how the tone of conversations shifted almost immediately, how voices softened, how curiosity replaced dismissal, and how respect appeared suddenly where it had been missing before. And that change, that immediate adjustment, hurt more deeply than any earlier slight, because it confirmed what I had quietly suspected all along, that my worth in their eyes had been tied not to who I was, but to what they believed I had. And when Emily's parents reached out with concern and a new tone of warmth, I accepted the calls calmly, but I listened closely to the words chosen, noticing how careful they now were. And when Emily herself became more attentive, more considerate, offering inclusion where exclusion had once existed, I felt neither satisfaction nor relief, only clarity. Because kindness that appears only when power is revealed is not kindness at all, but convenience. And when Daniel finally came to see me in person, his posture heavy with regret, and he said softly that he had not realized how things had felt, I looked at my son, the boy I had raised to notice others, and I realized that love alone does not guarantee awareness. And I told him gently that seeing and noticing are choices we make daily, and that silence should never be mistaken for consent. And as he sat there quietly, absorbing words he had avoided for too long, I felt no anger toward him, only sadness for the distance that comfort had created between us. And in that moment, I understood that the turning point was not about confrontation or revelation, but about recognition. Recognition that silence had allowed people to show me exactly who they were, and that once seen, such truths cannot be forgotten or undone. And though apologies followed in the days after, polite and carefully worded, I accepted them without resistance, but not without understanding, because the truth had already settled in my heart, steady and clear, reminding me that dignity does not depend on how loudly one speaks, but on how deeply one knows oneself, and that pretending to be small does not make one small at all. It simply allows others to reveal how they measure human worth. After the turning point, after the quiet revelation of truth that had been simmering for years without being acknowledged, life settled into a new rhythm that was softer, slower, and filled with small realizations. Because once the illusions had fallen away, I could finally see people as they truly were, and I could see myself clearly as well. And in the weeks that followed, the interactions with Emily and her family changed subtly, no longer filled with the polite distance that had defined so many months, but instead replaced by careful attention, questions that carried genuine curiosity rather than superficial judgment, and gestures that, though small, indicated that the space I had always deserved was finally being acknowledged. And I watched these changes unfold with a quiet heart, neither rushing or expecting perfection, because I understood that human hearts do not shift all at once, and that awareness often comes slowly after years of assumptions. And as Daniel became more present in noticing both Emily and me, I realized that he had learned the hardest lesson of all, that comfort in relationships can make us blind to what is quietly happening around us, and that noticing requires intention, effort, and sometimes courage. And I forgave him in that moment, not because he had been cruel, but because he had been unaware, and because forgiveness is the bridge that allows love to continue without carrying bitterness as its weight. And Emily, too, began to engage with me differently, with gestures that were neither forced nor performative, but honest and thoughtful, like asking for my opinion on small matters, including me in conversations, or simply acknowledging that my presence mattered. And when she did, I felt neither pride nor resentment, only a calm understanding that people reveal who they are when they think you are less, and that the patience I had carried all those months had allowed that truth to surface naturally. And in observing all of this, I found that my own role had shifted from silent observer to a quiet teacher, because my calm, consistent presence had modeled dignity, patience, and self-respect even in the absence of recognition. And I began to see the subtle beauty of that influence in how Daniel spoke of me to his friends, how Emily deferred to my experience without pretense, and how family gatherings no longer carried the tension that had once clung to every word and gesture. And in my own home, I could breathe deeply, feeling that I had survived months of quiet exclusion without losing my sense of self, which was more important than any apology or acknowledgement could ever be. And as I reflected on those long months, I understood that the pain I had felt was never about small slights or misunderstandings, but about learning the delicate truth that respect and love must be chosen, recognized, and maintained consciously because they cannot be assumed. And that realization shaped how I approached every relationship going forward, teaching me to observe more, trust less blindly, and speak when my silence was no longer serving me. And I began to live each day with a gentle intention, noticing the small gestures of kindness, acknowledging honesty, and holding boundaries with quiet strength, because I had learned that dignity is maintained not by proving oneself to others, but by remaining steadfast in truth. And in this calm reflection, I realized that patience, quiet strength, and emotional awareness had become my true allies, and that the greatest lessons of motherhood, family, and love are often hidden in silence, tested in small moments, and revealed when hearts are patient enough to notice. And over time, even as life continued with its usual uncertainties, I felt a lightness in my chest, because I knew that the place I held in this family was finally seen, appreciated, and respected, and that no amount of pretending would ever diminish what I had carried inside all along: my worth, my strength, and my quiet, enduring love. And as I looked back on those months of subtle hurt, silent observation, and patient endurance, I recognized that the true turning point had never been a confrontation or an argument, but the simple act of being present with dignity, of observing without judgment, and of allowing truth to surface naturally. And from that understanding came a deep peace, because I realized that life often teaches us lessons in gentle, almost invisible ways, and that the people who choose kindness even when it seems unnecessary are the ones whose hearts are worth knowing, while those who wait to be impressed by wealth, appearance, or status may eventually reveal themselves without needing to be exposed. And that lesson, calm and quiet as it was, would stay with me forever, guiding my interactions, shaping my expectations, and helping me see clearly who belongs in my life, who values me for myself, and who simply participates when it benefits them. And in that clarity, I found a subtle joy, a quiet strength, and a soft hope, because the experience had taught me that love, respect, and dignity are not measured by how others treat us in the moment, but by how we carry ourselves through every challenge, every slight, and every moment of patience. And I knew that the future would be gentler, not because people had changed completely, but because I had learned to see the truth without bitterness, to forgive without losing myself, and to continue loving without expectation. And in that calm, reflective space, I understood finally that my journey as a mother, as a woman, and as a quiet observer of human hearts had given me a profound understanding that life's deepest lessons are often hidden in spaces between words, the pauses between actions, and the silence that carries the loudest truths. And I smiled softly to myself, feeling at peace, because I knew that even in the moments of quiet hurt, I had never lost my worth, and that knowing, above all, was the most enduring gift of all.